This idea of the American high school is really interesting to suss out.
It's just showing where we are in the world right now, that this is something that's popular on TV and it's tackling everyday issues.
My name is Joshua. Hello.
Hi.
I am 28 years old and I'm from England, from the West Country, which is the southwest near London.
Hi, my name is Gail. I'm 28 years old and I'm from Paris. I'm in the suburbs.
Hey everyone, my name is Saxon. I'm from South Africa, Johannesburg. I'm 27 years old.
My name is Hannah. Guess I'm the slate baby of the group at 26, and I'm from Chicago in the US.
So I don't know about you guys, but for me, representation just means being able to identify with something in the media and feel that they're feeling my struggle and that I can relate and that I'm rooting for them.
I think for me it's different because I do see myself represented in like across so much media and TV shows, and it's such a part of our world that it's like over-representation for white men. So I definitely feel that I don't share that view of like, oh, it's important for me to see myself up on screen and be like, oh yeah, I have those same struggles. That's never occurred to me at all.
But like the inverse of it is like feeling the pressure to represent your community. Sometimes I'm just like, I want to represent all like the little Black South African children out there. Yeah, no, I'm doing a bad job. Yeah.
I feel that can definitely be an issue when you feel there are so few representations and that I feel there's more pressure the fewer representations there are. But the more representations you have of a community out there, the more diversity, the less pressure there is to have to embody an entire experience in a singular person, which is impossible. I've always felt like the power of representation, like it's this thing that then you watch something or you read something and then it becomes translated to your experience in the real world. And it's this sense of validation that, particularly as a teenager or at a vulnerable point in your life, can help push you to continue on your path because you see someone else who is facing those same struggles, dealing with those same challenges, but finding success or learning from them. And that for me was always like the representation that felt most valuable. And it didn't necessarily have to do with gender, race, or age. It could just be someone who you relate to their personality or their interests or just the stage that they are at in their life. You know, I think like the power of cartoons, like those can have felt like such validation and representation, even if they might feel very distant from reality.
I remember seeing Billy Elliot when I was like 17 and feeling very strongly that if I'd watched that when I was younger, it would have had much more of an impact on me. Not that it didn't have an impact, but I was like, this is the kind of film where I was as a young kid, I would have really valued the story of someone doing something different and wanting to be in the arts and like going against what their community said was going to be good for them. But I watched it when I was like 17. I was like, oh, if only someone had told me, you should go watch Billy Elliot because you'd really identify with that.
I think it's interesting now because like obviously so much media was accessible to us as kids, but I felt that there were barriers even back then that don't exist now, like us as somewhat digital natives, but still grew up in a time when our media consumption was often determined by what was on TV at a certain time. Like I could only imagine what it would have been like to have had Netflix or something like that as a young kid, where they might have had Billy Elliot and you might be like, okay, this kid from a small town who wants to be a dancer, like maybe that'd be interesting to me. And so I think like the control or agency that younger people have now over their media consumption, I think is really interesting and powerful. Like even like my niece and my nephew, like they're under the age of 10 and they like choose the cartoons they watch. And like for me, it's like, whatever was on TV was what I watched.
Well, I grew up watching mostly American TV shows. So I would say I used to be a huge fan of One Tree Hill. I love this show, but I kept comparing to France, where there was absolutely no representation of people of color or people who felt like me as a teenager. And if there were actually Black people on TV, would be really cliche, like super sassy and stuff like that, which I'm not. So it was difficult. I think it's also one of the reasons why I want to do the job that I want to do. It's just to hopefully inspire young teenagers to feel like they can be the main character.
Yeah.
And to identify. And obviously, I can relate to what you said about showing pretty much everyone in your community, but it's impossible.
Why do you think that France had fewer representations of people of color than the US media?
I have no idea. Even if we talk about like the very first gay character, it was only like maybe in 2005. And it was late, very, very late. And I have no idea why it took us so long. And it's still too slow for me, to be honest. I'm still looking for answers, though. It's changing slowly, but too slowly.
And what do you think is causing that change? Is it people like you or like...
I think we've been really influenced by what's going on in the States. And that is pushing people to fight. And I think it's important, but it's kind of sad that we need other countries to do the same, because obviously there are some problems of representations, and my friends always get casted for like the terrorist or the bad guy, and that's not fun. And I think we are in need of more dramatic roles and more representation. But Omar Sy is doing a very good job, I think, and he had to take that path of comedy, then branching into different stuff, and that's cool too. But I hope it's going to be different for others in the future.
When I was in South Africa, I didn't feel, for me, the media was like super different. You know, it's like black people everywhere on TV, and we're a multi-racial country. So there's like lots of people of color, different races and nationalities on TV. So it was very normal. And then I moved to Ireland, where it's just like hardly any black people on TV. I'm like, oh. And then I go back home, and I'm like, wow, it's such a culture shock. And then you move here, and then you realize, okay, it's not that much, but it's opening up, and you kind of feel exotic and different, and like, ooh, yeah, I can do this. So it feels like an interesting new world that I'm ready to explore and ready to like find out with everyone. Whereas like South Africa, it doesn't feel, for me, it just feels normal. Like that's my ordinary, everyday life.
For me, where I grew up, it's like 100% white. Like my high school was maybe 400 people, and there'd be 1 or 2 non-white people in the entire year group. Moving to London, it was a real like culture shock, but I didn't leave the country. I was like 2 hours up the road, and suddenly I was living in Southeast London in a really, really multicultural, multiracial section of the city. And I was like, wow, on this bus stop, it's like a interracial couple, or like this is advertised, this glasses brand is advertised by a black man, but at home, it's all like white. It's all like advertising, because the companies don't feel the need to like, this is a massive stereotype, like generalization, and maybe it's different now, but I definitely remember being like, this was in 2014, thinking, wow, I've come to a really, really different place, and I've not really moved very far.
Yeah. Sex Education on Netflix particularly just made me feel like I want to go to high school in like England and see what it's like. You know? I want to experience that life. But also, it's just showing where we are in the world right now, that this is something that's popular on TV, and it's tackling everyday issues of what's going on, like with just teenagers.
I haven't seen Sex Education, but I've seen a trailer, and I can tell you that's not what British looks like at all. I mean, as far as I'm aware, they don't wear a uniform, right, in the show?
Yeah, no.
And all schools in the UK wear a uniform.
Yeah.
And like, when I watched the trailer, I was like, this show's set in America. Like 100%. This show is set in like Rhode Island, in some like elite boarding school. And then when someone told me, like, no, it's supposed to be Britain. It's like, what? What part of that visual is Britain? Like, everyone would be wearing uniform. There would be, talking about representation, I was like, that is misrepresenting a whole nation of like school kids.
Yeah.
Well, I think this idea of the American high school is really interesting to suss out and talk about, because it's so defines people's perceptions of the US, especially young people who grew up watching shows that take place in American high schools and having gone to one and experienced that. It's so far from reality. But when people talk to me about the US and growing up there, most of the questions revolve around, is it like the movies, like TV? And it's funny because I went to the high school where the founder of Nike went to. So like could not think of more of a sports American, high school, but like no one cared about football. No one went to any of the games. Like no one really, like none of those sort of jocks, popular kid stereotypes really played out in the way. And I think even me, I had expectations going into high school, having watched all these American shows that give these ideas of this being this sort of magical place and microcosm, but it really just is so normal. But I think that that's a really interesting exploitation of American culture that doesn't often reflect reality.
I think that's just a weird thing about TV shows and movies set in America, is that a lot of them take place in high schools. Like I can't really think of many like French movies or like that are set in a school where like the setting is really important. You might have like a film about young people and therefore like school is a part of that. But in Britain, like a lot of movies about young people, they're like, yeah, they go to school because they have to. And like, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to focus on like what's interesting about their lives. Whereas the American high school is like a place to set a movie, or it's like an interesting place to set a TV show. But as you say, like that setting has to come with like a set of rules of like what a TV American high school has to look like, rather than what a real one might be like.
Just remember watching like Mean Girls and thinking, I'm never going to America. That was it. No, I was alive.
I remember like I watched that movie at 12 or 13 and just not feeling ready for high school. Like you said, like you watch that and you're like,
So never.
this seems like it's
super
scary.
scary.
Yeah. And it's funny because it was based off like a nonfiction book called, I think it's called Queen Bees and Wannabes. And the whole idea was examining I think a sociologist or a psychologist looking at like the minds of teenage girls. And then they turn it into this comedy movie.
But it also makes me think like shows have to have conflict. Like all performance has to have conflict. Otherwise it's boring. Otherwise there's nothing to watch. But so often shows about young people, the conflict is them against each other as opposed to them against something. Like you think about Shakespeare, we've just done The Tempest. It is not really much like getting at each other. It's more, characters who have something wrong with God, or they're going to commit a murder and they're not sure if they should. But so often with teenagers, with young people, it's like their problem is like another person. That other person's personality clashes with their personality, or someone has said something and that's what the issue is. And that can be quite unhealthy, I think. It's quite damaging, I guess, that I definitely felt a kinship, but nowhere near the level that those kids were taking it to. Like we would go to sneak out and like have a couple of beers and be like, oh, it's just like skin. It's like, oh, it's complete crap. Like they turned everything up to the max, but we felt that rebellious kind of British kids rebelling represented us to a certain degree. So we loved that show, but it was still like not the healthiest role model to have as a young person, I think.
I think in that regard, in France, there has been like a show that has been pretty famous for the last years that is doing a great job, I think. It's changing things slowly. It's called Scam France. I don't know if any of you have seen it. There's like 7 seasons or something like that. And it's really nice because you see teenagers dealing with stuff that young adults might deal with. Identity crisis, figuring out their sexuality, or being poor, or having to go through depression, stuff like that. Even though sometimes I'm just like, no 17 years old would think like that. I feel like it's slightly too mature, but I know that it has helped people to feel represented and somehow validated. And like they could see their struggle in some young teenagers. So it's like one of the very first French show that shows teenagers, because growing up there was no TV show that would portray high schoolers.
What's interesting with Scam too is it started in Norway. and it's been adapted
Yeah.
by all these countries,
Yeah.
including in the US. And it's a lot of them have been like online, like YouTube only adaptations. So I think it's interesting, and like a lot of them, they keep the similar plots and narratives and maybe adapt certain things to the local country. But it's interesting how these sort of broader narratives of this teenagehood really cross countries, cross cultures. And I think, it was only in the US where they actually brought it to, I think it was on MTV or another network, and actually didn't do very well. But I think it because they tried to standardize and follow the sort of traditional TV model that it didn't end up being as good. And ironically enough, American Skins, they also tried to do that, and it wasn't very good at all.
What you're describing, I haven't seen the show. It sounds quite socially responsible. Like it's a show. It's funny you say it comes out of Scandinavia. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like, Scandinavia is great for like crime, but I do feel like this society in those countries, there is a strong sense of society and like a strong sense of like moral sensibility, stereotypically. And it's just funny, like you say, oh, this is a great show, and actually originated in Norway. It's like, maybe that's why it has the format that it does, and maybe we'll educate people about the struggles of young people as opposed to just like showing them like fighting. And then you say it goes to the US and doesn't do very well. It's like a lesson in maybe what's slightly wrong with youth portrayal in America, perhaps.
I don't know if you guys have watched Euphoria at all.
It was amazing.
Yeah, it's I think it really is responding to a lot of. It doesn't glamorize. It glamorizes at times, but it also really shows the dark underbelly that a lot of the shows in the past didn't. And it's still, I think, to me, if I'd watched it as a teenager, it would have felt intimidating still. But the characters do feel more relatable and real, and they do feel more like people I would have known, because they just feel more complex. They feel, and I mean, it partly because they have really good actors and actresses, but they just feel like they're not fully formed because they're teenagers, but they feel formed for the age that they're playing. I would like to see more representation in media that's not coming from the United States. Well, I think that in American media, there's been a lot of progress in terms of representation, and the stories that are being told just coming from one country isn't enough in terms of representation. And there are so many stories around the world that should also be told.
I think that there should be less coming through platforms like Netflix, and it's becoming completely part of our lives now, where pretty much any major distributor of media has a platform that they're going to push that through, whether it's Netflix or Hulu or HBO, and partly centralizing shows that are made by that platform onto their own things. You can't access them elsewhere. But also making us watch things through algorithms and trying to, in trying to select what we watch, pushing us to watch repetitive things or things on the same theme, which ultimately is going to narrow your world view. I think, thinking back to the video store as a kid, although it was still a selection of films, it wasn't a selection of films that someone thought that I might want to watch. It was just a broad selection of the latest movies, plus, whatever else was in the bargain bin in Tesco. So at least it was someone without an agenda going, well, these are all popular, so we can rent these to kids, as opposed to, the thousands of titles on Netflix, but you only see a small portion of that Netflix thinks you want to watch.
I would actually like to see like more representation of like people of color just having a lead role, and the lead role not having to be about some type of struggle of slavery or overcoming oppression, just a normal lead role, or like having Black females not have to be strong, Black, sassy females, just be vulnerable and able to cry. I'd like to see that.
More in the theatre, I particularly enjoy classics, and when you have a classic story, Shakespeare or Chekhov, you're presented with a problem, which is this story was written by white people for white people. So in a modern context, there is no role for a non-white person. There is no maid, or whatever it might be. So you basically just like, well, we can cast people, whatever, doesn't matter. And this role, whether, Masha in Three Sisters, you can, in part of the creative process, be like, right, we're going to cast this as a Black woman, and we're going to choose or select or investigate what about Masha is interesting in terms of culture for Black women. but those are all artistic choices. There's no restriction there. And I think that's amazing. And I feel like, why can't that happen in TV as well? You know, we don't necessarily have to make shows which fit into social norms and rules. We can just choose characters who could be played by anybody. And then in that, we can choose to make a social commentary with that character or not. Or you can just say, right, this person is going to play Masha and they're going to be Japanese, and we are not going to question why. We're just going to say it as it is, and this person is going to play it, and you can read into that what you will.
I mean, that's the thing I think with like theater, it's because you're asking the audience to invest and indulge with the imagination and travel along. But with TV, it's like very more realistic.
Yep.
I watched something like The Incredible Life of David Copperfield, or
Yeah,
where it was complete colorblind casting, and I was like, oh, wow. And then 2 seconds later, my mind was going, this doesn't make sense. This does not make sense. How come he's Indian, but his mom is white? But then at the end of the movie, I was just like, yeah, you know what? I was like, wow, it was fun.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. I just didn't care, but I liked it. I would like to see more of that.
Yeah.
It's like the last show, Bridgerton,
Yeah.
like people debating about like the
What?
cast being like
This
black
is-
and all, but it's hard because it's like if you want to stick to history,
Yeah.
but at the same time you want to see more people of color on screen, so it's pretty tough.
I had that debate with someone who was like, I get the idea of Bridgerton, but if you're basing it in the UK on rules that were already set in a time that we know Black people were oppressed, for me, it feels like it's undermining what as Black people went through in that time, and just kind of saying, oh, well, it didn't happen. It was all raised like roses and daisies. Whereas like, if it was set in a completely made up country with those rules, then I'll be like, okay, you know, I get it.
I think if you're going to go back and say like, we are taking a schism away from what's historically accurate, you have to go there in a way that's not just, we're going to basically keep the entire cultural restraints of the time with regards to like costume or makeup, but we're just going to change the actor. You have to think, well, you know, we're out of history now. We can choose what we want to do. We can make changes. We can make sure that this person expresses themselves in terms of what they wear in a different way. It doesn't have to be exactly historically accurate. Because I think that's the problem. If you go down the route of saying, oh, well, that didn't happen, it's like, well, you'll never tell an interesting story. And you're basically saying we should never do historical work. We should just always make modern work, because we'll never be able to get history right and be representative of all races and genders and everything. So
it was cool though to watch it and be like, okay, these are the beginning. This is the building blocks.
And it's changing.
Yeah, it's changing.
It's nice.
It took a long time, but it's changing.
this was so much fun. Thank you so much.
It was an absolute pleasure to meet you
Very
guys.
interesting.